Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and today I'm delighted to be speaking with Jamie Woodhouse. He's a father, a husband, an ex-management consultant, but he'll be talking to me today about his passion and vocation in and around sentientism. Sentientism is a simple philosophy. It's all about evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. Jamie established and operates the Sentientism podcast and YouTube channel. He campaigns in pursuit of a sentientist manifesto, and he's an active Twitterer, tweeting thoughts and ideas and sometimes even challenges about how we might look after all sentient beings. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Jamie Woodhouse. Well, Jamie Woodhouse, thanks so much for giving up your time to come and have a chat with me on what I like to affectionately call compassion in a t-shirt. Hence the t-shirt, you see.
Yeah, you actually do have compassion on the t-shirt. No, it's great to be here, Stan. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been listening to your podcast for a little while now, and so very excited to meet you, first of all. But, you know, you have a very intelligent and warm interviewing style. In fact, you have quite an intelligent and warm disagreeing style, which I find very refreshing and very nice to listen to that sort of stuff these days. You know, when people can have, you know, good, robust conversations that where sometimes there might be bits that people agree on or disagree on, but anyway, I hope I can do this conversation a bit of justice as well. So, thank you again.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That's kind words too. And the only thing I would say is that if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see a different level of snarkiness that will probably undermine your confidence in my amiable conversational style. So I don't always hold myself to those standards, unfortunately, but I try.
Well, I did pre-record the introduction, and I did allude to that actually in the introduction, that you have a sort of you're a what I didn't say prolific, but anyway, you're a big tweeter, and you like to put challenges out there, things for us to think about, which I think, you know, that's the idea. I mean, one of our sort of thoughts from the perspective of compassion that I take is really that compassion takes strength and courage as much as anything else, you know, to do the tough stuff, you know, and so quite often compassion isn't just lovely and fluffy and warm or something. It can sometimes mean, you know, fighting for justice, or, you know, that sort of thing. So I find it wonderful all ways round. But yeah, I guess what I was curious, first of all, just to maybe hear a bit about just yourself, your work, your life, maybe, perhaps what you're sort of working on or what inspires you. A bit of who's Jamie Woodhouse, first of all?
Yeah, cool. Yes, so as you said, my name's Jamie Woodhouse. I live in deep North London with my family, 2 teenage kids, wife, and a crazy canine called Luna, who may make an appearance in the background if we're lucky.
Yeah.
And I guess my sort of professional background and day job, if you like, is as a consultant, helping companies, helping people. But the most interesting thing I'm focused on is this idea of sentientism, which is going to be the core of what we talk about today. It's a worldview or a philosophy, and I'm just doing what I can to develop it and ideally popularize it.
And actually, I think that would be a great place to just start, is to hear a little bit about, you know, perhaps what sentientism really is. I'm not sure that everyone has a sort of a thorough sense of that in a way. So yeah, I'm keen to hear what is sentientism, and perhaps how did you get into all of that?
Yeah. So in a sentence, I'd describe it as evidence, reason, and having compassion for all sentient beings. But you might want to take a step back and say, well, okay, what even is this thing? And I describe sentientism as a worldview or a philosophy. And I think worldviews are important because whether or not we make them explicit, all of us have them. They're really ways of thinking about the world. And to my mind, the most important questions that our worldviews are trying to answer are, what's real? What is reality? How should we believe things? What's right and wrong? But also what and who matters. What should we care about? What should our ethics and morality be? So I think worldviews are really important because whether we talk about them explicitly or not, we have them. And those are two of the deepest questions we're trying to answer. But I think it's good to be explicit about our worldviews and to challenge them and to make sure they're well-founded. So I guess that's where sentientism fits in. It's trying to answer those two questions, what's real and who matters, with the sentence I just laid out. So it suggests that when we're thinking about what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach that uses evidence and reason, engage with reality to try and understand it honestly, and being aware of our own biases and the problems in our own reasoning and our perception, of course, but use evidence and reason to decide what to believe. And when we're thinking about what and who matters, the clue is in the name, that we should grant compassion or have moral consideration for all sentient beings. So any being that has the capacity to suffer, to flourish, to have experiences. So that's it, really. A super simple answer to the questions of what's real and who matters.
Yeah, and there's two key pieces, really, isn't there? There's the evidence and reason piece, and then there's the ethics, compassion piece. And I must admit, yeah, as I listen to your podcast, I'm first drawn to evidence and reason. I come from a long line of sort of actually educators and medical practitioners is sort of my ancestors.
Yeah.
So I guess science and the natural world and what can we observe and, how can we even measure it sometimes, those are sort of, that I guess that's actually a worldview for me in a way, I suppose. You might have a word for that perhaps, but tell us more about that side of it, I guess, like from a sentientist point of view, evidence and reason, what are we really looking for there?
Well, there's a few different choices that you can take about when you're thinking about this part of your worldview. How should we believe and what should we believe? So if I set some of those choices out, there's one is what you might call fideism or faith, where someone will believe something in itself without asking for or without wanting evidence and reason to support it. So that's quite a pure sort of faith-based way of believing things about the world. So some religious people think that way, not all. So that's one choice you might take, is say, I don't need evidence and reason, I have faith. Another alternative is, which can be related, is dogmatism, where you just believe something, again, somewhat arbitrarily or because someone else told you it, but without looking for evidence or reason to back it up. And also, you tend to sort of ignore or turn away from evidence or reasoning that might undermine this belief. So dogmatism is another choice. There's another choice which I'm suggesting, which is one of naturalism, where we try to start out from a reasonably neutral standpoint and a humble standpoint of thinking about what to believe. And we say, well, the best way of giving ourselves a good chance of being right about things is to just engage honestly with reality as we find it. And in a way, that's what evidence is. Evidence is information about reality. And I think of evidence in a very broad sense. So yes, absolutely, it can include scientific evidence, randomized controlled trials or, explicitly designed experiments with very clear analytical results. But I think of evidence in a much broader sense than that as well. I think evidence includes our own personal experiences, the things I'm perceiving. I'm pretty confident this coffee mug exists, but I haven't done science to work that out, really. It's a direct perception. So I think there's lots of different types of evidence. I think of evidence very broadly, but we should be skeptical of all of them, and we should be open to new evidence as we work things through. So evidence isn't about perfectly understanding reality, of course. There's no such thing as perfect evidence, but it's honestly trying to gather information about reality. And then the reasoning side also isn't perfect. There's no real such thing as perfect reasoning. We always have biases and flaws in our reasoning. Essentially, we're sort of evolved apes that developed cognitive capabilities designed for surviving on the savannah. So, we should be humble about our own abilities to reason, but at the same time, reasoning, thinking critically, logically, and clearly seems to me the only sensible way of trying to understand the world around us. So again, let's not kid ourselves, it's perfect. Let's be humble about it. But it seems to me that those two tools, evidence and reasoning, are the only viable way of understanding the world. But let's not kid ourselves that they're going to give us perfect answers or that we should ever be totally confident in what we come up with. So those are three choices, I guess, if you like: fideism, dogmatism, or a sort of naturalistic way of understanding the world. But there's also a risk here too, because quite often people will use scientific language describing their thinking as being based on evidence and reasoning to justify a belief that they came up with in advance, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So many people who have a fideistic, a faith-based belief or a dogmatic belief will still talk a great deal about evidence and reason. But as you engage with them, you'll come to realize that the only evidence they're interested in is the evidence that supports the belief they already want to hold. And the only reasoning they're willing to follow is the reasoning that supports the belief they want to hold. And they will warp or reject or ignore the evidence and reasoning that challenges them. So that, in a way, that's a sort of fake naturalism, which is pretending to be a naturalistic person using a scientific method, but actually you've already decided what you want to believe. So that's a sort of broad portfolio of choices. And that's why I'm suggesting this naturalism is probably our best bet at understanding reality well. And we should want to understand reality well if we want to make a better world.
Yes, it almost becomes a debating tactic at that point, doesn't it? For people who might have a dogmatic view, might then use sort of this kind of evidence reason sort of version of things to just as a tactic to try to make an argument or make a point or sort of, but the true sort of evidence-based, empirical-based kind of approach really comes, first of all, from that place of humility where we know that we don't necessarily know and we may never know perfectly, but it's always a work in progress, trying to gradually know more and more or closer and closer to perhaps the reality.
And I think that's the absolute heart of a naturalistic worldview, but also a scientific worldview, is that humility, that doubt, always being open to new evidence, never being so sure you're totally locked down. So your beliefs maybe are provisional, which means they're open to new evidence all the time. And they're maybe probabilistic, so that you're never 100% sure something is true or not true because you're open to new evidence. Yeah. And I think that humility and that doubt is at the heart of the scientific method and at the heart of naturalism. But it often, again, because we're flawed humans, even people with a very scientific worldview can come across as being very dogmatic. So there is this impression of some people in the scientific world that they're dismissive of alternative points of view. They've done the randomized control trial, they have the spreadsheet with the regression analysis, and here is the answer. And it's like, well, okay, that's good evidence. It's maybe very good quality evidence. And maybe I have a high credence in the things you come up with, but it's still not 100%. And we still need to be open to new ideas, new evidence. So, but I mean,
that sort of stuff is, or has been sort of writ large, hasn't it? These last couple of years, people really retreating into their more dogmatic positions. And then that's this division, I think, that I was kind of alluding to at the beginning, just makes it hard to have conversations when people are kind of more stuck in their dogmas. I mean, there's as much joy in a way as, discovering some sort of evidence against what we might think as there is discovering evidence for what we might think. And it's sort of, that to me is the sort of the joy and excitement and so on of taking a scientific approach, is you're just not really ever sure, actually.
Yeah.
What might
and
be.
I think you find that. And I think you find that when you talk to the best scientists, and you can see it in whether it's whatever field it is, biology or chemistry or something else, or physics is a great example, where the physicists working on things like the Large Hadron Collider are most excited about the possibility of finding out they're wrong, and that there's something else they don't know, and there's some new vista that might open up. There's wonder and awe and excitement in that uncertainty, but at the same time, just keep working to try and understand things better. So yeah, I find that quite powerful.
It's the great conversation, isn't it? That's been kind of happening, you know, for millennia. You know, always just this great conversation as we gradually discover more. But bringing it back to the topic of sentientism, you mentioned suffering and flourishing, and one of the little questions that has bubbled up in my mind as I've listened to some of your work, your podcasts, and so on, is this bit about evidence and reason and knowing or you know, the reality of suffering in non-human sentient beings. And I was curious, you know, there's sort of I guess reason makes sense. We know that we experience that. We can sort of observe an animal and it makes sense that they might be suffering. But yeah, can you talk a bit about evidence and reason and how that might approach kind of understanding the inner world really of other sentient beings and their experience of suffering?
Yeah, and there's so many areas where these two tenets link. So many people like to keep them very separate. There's, if you like, epistemology on one side of how do we understand the world, and evidence and reason on the other choices. And on the other side, there's ethics. So some people like to draw a really clear dividing line between the two, but I can't help seeing links across them. And this is one of them. And I think that's one of the areas where there's quite a nice complementarity between thinking about sentience as the grounding characteristic of compassion and moral consideration, and having this sort of naturalistic worldview, because I think sentience is a phenomenon of the natural world. So instead of saying, you know, we care about others because they have a soul, or because, you know, there's a deity that told us to, or there's some other higher purpose or higher power, the reason we care about them is because they have sentience, and that sentience means they have the capacity to have experiences. And just as I value my own experiences, you know, I don't like suffering and I do like flourishing. In a sense, morality is a choice to care about and value the way others value their own experiences. You know, so I care about your suffering because you don't like it. So that's part of the link. This thinking about sentience, I think, is a characteristic of the natural world. So I think that's why they're quite complementary. And I agree. This is a tricky subject to work around when you're thinking particularly about consciousness and sentience, because in its purest sense, you know, how can we be 100% sure that non-human animals experience things? And you can also say, well, how are we 100% sure that each other are experiencing things? You know, you could be a sort of empty automaton, or, you know, just a clever simulation on a Zoom screen. You know, maybe you're not experiencing things at all. So there's that extreme solipsistic stance where people say, look, I'm confident I exist and I'm experiencing, but maybe others don't. And I think when we talk about other humans, most people will say, well, that's patently ridiculous, because, you know, and why is it ridiculous? Why do we have confidence that each other as humans suffer? And I'd suggest there's probably, you know, a few different lines of inference we might use to build our confidence that, you know, you, Stan, can suffer. So one is about evolutionary history and evolutionary context. You know, you and I are both very similar. If you look at the tree of life and the evolutionary history of all of our millions of years of ancestors, you know, what we went through. So I'm highly confident that I experience things because I am moment to moment. I know you've gone through an extremely similar evolutionary process that in a naturalistic worldview is really what's built us. So it would seem odd that I've gone through this process. You've gone through the very same process. I experience things and you don't. So there's an evolutionary adaptability story there around, you know, our confidence that we can experience things. There's also behavior. So, you know, I'm watching you, I'm listening to you, I can see how you react. If we were in the same room together and I pinched your arm, I'd see you respond to that. So that those behavioral actions and the things I'm seeing, again, they don't tell me exactly that you are suffering or flourishing, but they give me a pretty strong indication, because I react in those same ways and I feel things, that when you react in those ways, you're probably feeling those things too. So there's a behavioral and a communication pattern that I can observe in you that gives me some confidence too. The final thing we can do is put you in an MRI scanner or something similar, and at least a sort of clunky highly pixelated level, observe the information processing that's going on in your mind. And there are lots of different philosophies of mind about what sentience and consciousness are. I think sentience really just is a pattern of information processing. But even the people who disagree with me and think it's something else recognize that it's tightly correlated with the information processing that's going on in our brain. So in the same way as, I know I'm feeling things when I'm in an fMRI scanner and I can see the patterns of blood flow or electrical activity. If I do the same experiment with you, again, it gives me more confidence that you probably suffer and flourish and experience things the same way I do. So those three lines of evidence and inference apply to non-human animals in exactly the same way. So again, you can look at the evolutionary context of why humans may have developed the capacity to feel pain, and it's pretty obvious that non-human animals developed exactly the same thing, and they probably developed it many millions of years before humans even came on the scene. So my amateurish sense of it, maybe in the Precambrian, is that it was evolutionarily adaptable, had value to be able to sense good things, sense bad things, feel the impact of those and move towards the good and away from the bad. So I think in a way that was the evolutionary genesis, if you like, to use a religious term, of where sentience came from. So there's that evolutionary story that I think helps us understand that, sentience predates humans by many hundreds of millions of years, most likely, and therefore is also very broadly spread through the current animal kingdom. Secondly, again, it's the behavior and the activity and the communication. So we can observe non-human animals. Anyone who has a companion animal in the house will already have this visceral sense that, of course, they experience things. They feel love and pleasure and pain and fear. And again, we can, extend that observation out across the animal kingdom and build that strong line of evidence too. But we also recognize that non-human animals have very analogous information processing in terms of either the explicit structure of the brain, or at least functionally in terms of the types of information processing that's going on. So it's nociception, the senses of pain, the processes of awareness of that pain that go on in the mind. So we can actually look at the information processing that's going on in non-human animals. So in the same way as I've developed, pretty high confidence, put it in the 99.99% range that you are sentient, I think we can take that exact same approach to develop a very high credence in the sentience of very many non-human animals. So it's a long answer, but hopefully that gives you a sense of what I think the story is for believing that non-human animals can suffer.
No, that's really helpful.
I'm going to add. Yeah. I'm sorry to cut across you. I'm going to add the fourth method, which is just look into the eyes of a puppy. And so you can drop all the science. You can just spend some quality time with non-human animals, and you'll know it. So there's an intuitive route to the same answer too.
And it's interesting though, because one of the differences. And it's an unfortunate one, I suspect, that we are sort of up against with lots of people, is that, animals can't simply just tell us that they're suffering, that they're not able to make a statement or, advocate for themselves or express, in nice, clear forms just how difficult it is, and so that's, I think, where a lot of people perhaps, kind of fall down in terms of, really being able to connect with the suffering of non-human animals.
I think there's some truth in that. Non-human animals can't use human language except in very rudimentary forms. Look at some of the corvids or the chimpanzees and so on. So that's true, but they do communicate with us, and they communicate with us very clearly. So the other day I accidentally trod on our puppy's paw while she was running around my feet. It wasn't. She's not injured. She's absolutely fine. But her reaction to that told me in no uncertain terms that she felt that pain. And I think, again, that's true across much of the animal kingdom. Not all of it, but much of the animal kingdom is the communication is actually pretty clear and direct, if only we would listen. Now, when you get to some branch of the animal kingdom, you consider fish as a good example. Maybe that communication gap is so far, so distant that it becomes harder. But even there are responses and reactions and other things going on that if we'll open our mind to what those non-human animals are trying to tell us, the message is pretty clear, and it's pretty simple and what you might expect. They are messages like, please don't hurt me, and please don't take my family away, or I'm hungry, or at least those very basic communications, or I like you. These basic communications are actually there if we'll only look for them.
Yes, they have a number of those same. Well, certainly the kind of what we might think of as the threat system. That even just that fight, flight, responding type stuff is very clear. Even in fish, like they run away, and if or swim away, I suppose.
And the positive stuff too, right? And to your theme of compassion, you can see non-human animals, fish, dogs, pigs, cows, chickens, carry on with the list as long as you like. I have a very high degree of confidence that mothers feel compassion for their young, and you can see that in their behavior.
Yes,
so the positive aspects of those expressions are there too.
Yeah, I'm keen to hear your thoughts on that actually in a moment. But just to sort of, so there's definitely that sense of the various animals, including humans, have evolved together, and there's sort of evidence in there. There's certain behaviors or communications or things that we can observe that kind of indicate perhaps suffering. Is there any actual MRI studies of? I'm suspecting there would be, of chimpanzees, for example, maybe, or I mean, is there any of the neuroscience there that has compared human suffering and what the brain does with non-human animals?
There is, unfortunately, and this is one of the really frustrating things, because the study of animal sentience is in a sense deeply important, because it helps us to understand that they can suffer. But sadly, a great deal of that experimentation involves causing those animals to suffer so we can study them suffering. So we conduct experiments on them in ways that you'd never consider doing to a human out of intellectual curiosity, even though the object of the study is the very suffering itself. So it's a difficult space, but in short, a broad range of formal scientific experiments have been done that demonstrate very strongly the capacity for non-human animals to suffer. And some of those are brain scans and neurological, some of them are behavioral, others are doing tests using things like analgesics, because if you can change the behavior of a non-human animal using the presence of pain and then analgesics, and you can see the change, again, there's an implication there that the pain is being experienced because the analgesic dulls the effect of it. So there are many different experiments, many of them deeply unpleasant and most of them coercive, but again, it's part of the evidence, and I'd hope the evidence base is strong enough that would justify us not doing any more of these experiments, frankly. But the scientific evidence is extremely strong, and you can see that being reflected through the Cambridge Declaration on Animal Consciousness, which came out a while ago. By the time this episode goes out, there will be a new declaration, a Montreal Declaration, that takes that to the next step and explains what the implications of animal sentience and consciousness are for the way we exploit them. So there's a very strong scientific consensus about the prevalence of non-human animal suffering, although still some really interesting debates around the some of the fuzzy edges. So when you're looking at things like bivalves or some of the simpler invertebrates, some of the simplest insects, there's open, interesting questions about whether sentience fades away to nothing, or whether there's a cutoff point, or which of those species sentience might be present in. No, thank you for all of that, and I might actually get onto you after we've spoken and see if you can give me a couple of those links, not least the Montreal thing that's coming up. So that would be good to follow up on that little bit. Another little question. Absolutely. And the general, I don't want to make it too obvious a plug, but we run a Sentientism Reddit, which is a great resource for all sorts of different links. And many of them do talk about non-human animal sentience, so that's a good resource. But I can certainly send you some. We can have a look at that, and I'll pop some links in the show notes, that sort of thing, of course, and that'll be great. I've noticed you've used words like pain and suffering in an almost interchangeable way,
And I wondered whether you see them as the same or whether you distinguish, the two.
Yeah, all these terms are pretty fuzzy in common usage and even in philosophy, but I tend to think of suffering as broader than pain. So I tend to try and use the terms suffering and flourishing because I think they're broader than pain and pleasure. When you talk about pain and pleasure, people tend to think of physical pains and pleasures in quite narrow types of experience, whereas I think of suffering as any negative experience, anything with a negative valence, anything we don't like. So that could be physical pain, it could be existential angst, it could be a sense of loss, fear, anything that feels negative to the experiencer. And in the same way, I think about flourishing as being, yes, it is happiness and yes, it is pleasure, but it's also a sense of meaning, a sense of richness, a sense of awe and wonder. Again, flourishing can be extremely broad. So I tend to prefer those broader terms because I think any valence, any value in our sentient experience is morally significant.
I washed down the back patio today, and I have a Labrador, Bruno, who is a chocolate Labrador.
Oh, beautiful dogs. Yeah, gorgeous.
Yes. Yeah. And after I washed it all down, of course, he was wet, and so he couldn't come inside. And I could see a type of suffering there, a sort of a disappointment, a longing, a wishing that he could, and he sat at the back glass door and just peered at me and occasionally tried to tap on the door to let me know that he was unhappy. And I must admit I ignored him for a little while, and then a little bit later I took him for a walk, and I observed the other end of the spectrum. He was flourishing out there. There's something very, very special for him about being able to sniff smells, around the neighborhood. And it's not even the walking, I don't think, although he does, I think he loves that too, but it's the sniffing. That's when he's flourishing, so I get it, you
a whole world of smell out there.
Yeah, exactly. So but it's interesting because for me, suffering and flourishing sometimes have a connotation around the experiencer either sort of struggling with the pain or, sort of somehow enjoying the pleasure or feeling satisfaction out of the pleasure in a way, that's in some ways, at least a lot of human suffering because I'm a clinical psychologist, I work with people, all the time who are suffering from anxiety or depression and that sort of thing. And one of the ways that they suffer is by wishing they weren't, kind of having the experience of pain, and that in some ways there's the pain and then there's the struggle with the pain that kind of, causes even all the more suffering. But I think with Bruno today, you could almost see he was struggling with, there was longing there, and then there was this kind of joy, and so I don't know. But what do you think about that idea of pain, and then when we sort of struggle with pain, that causes us greater angst or greater suffering?
I think there's something to that, and to me, it comes back to the way I think of morality and ethics is that it's about me caring about or valuing the way you yourself value your own experiences. So it's how you as a sentient being feel that matters to me in that system. So in that context, I can imagine a situation where you're experiencing a physical pain, but you manage to maybe in a sort of meditative or a Buddhist context, come to some sort of acceptance of an awareness of that physical pain such that you are no longer suffering. So I can imagine a situation where, yes, you are in physical pain, but you're not actually experiencing a negative valence. That might be a difficult state to achieve, but I can conceptually achieve that.
Yes.
I can conceptually imagine that. So what matters to me is how you yourself feel about that experience, not whether your nociception thing is firing because your finger has been cut.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
And
your
that would,
experience, yeah.
that would include, all sentient beings, and that all sentient beings experience in their way this pain or suffering, and that's what's important. It's not about imposing how we might experience onto other humans even, but certainly other perhaps sentient beings, but rather really just honoring.
I'd agree, and that's yeah, and that's a difficult thing to do, because you can never completely escape your own perspective, of course. But I think that's the essence, is really genuinely trying to do that. And it's of course there is a different challenge when we think about non-human species, because it's there is at least another step removed. But that can lead you into a few different routes. One is you can think, well, maybe they're simpler, so they don't have quite such intense experiences as us, and maybe they're not quite so important. Another route you can follow is say, well, actually, us humans have got quite a lot of capabilities, technical and emotional and intellectual, that can help us to mitigate pain and suffering. So maybe non-human animals actually feel pain and fear and distress in an even more visceral way than we do. I can't remember who suggested this thought experiment, but they suggested, imagine a chimpanzee going to the dentist compared to you going to the dentist. You might both feel exactly the same physical discomfort from whatever is being done to you, but you're there out of, because ultimately that there's a benefit for you, it will be over, you can trust the person doing it to you. The chimpanzee won't necessarily understand any of those things.
Yes.
So I think that there's an important cautionary point there, that non-human animals may in some circumstances feel things in an even more visceral way than we do.
Yes, definitely. Part of my work would be helping people to find some acceptance, around things, or B, make some sort of sense out of it, or meaning, that helps people to suffer less. Whereas the chimpanzee going into the MRI scanner for the sake of research would be terrified, not knowing what on earth was going on. That's very helpful. So what about, and I know there was a lot of segue there, and you sort of mentioned that the two aspects really do kind of complement each other, but what about the ethics side then of sentientism? Where would you sort of take us there in terms of that side?
Yeah. So for me, there are some ways of thinking about ethics that might be egoistic. You should only care about yourself, or they might be supernatural in nature. We should do whatever God says, even if it's a bad thing. But I think if we put those things to one side, most people would agree that ethics and morality are about how and whether we care about others and our impact on the world. Many of them are focused on how we should behave and the decisions we should take, but ultimately the reason we care about that is because of how and whether we care about others. So sentientism takes a very simple stance, and it says, well, there's loads of different ways of thinking about ethics. You might take a sort of deontological approach that thinks about rules or rights. You might take a utilitarian approach that thinks about well-being and utility and value in that sense. You might take a feminist care ethic approach that thinks about our obligations of care, or a related relational approach that thinks about the nature of different relations, or a virtue ethics that thinks about being good and kind and courageous, or whatever your virtues are. Right? So there's so many different things you can choose from on the menu of ethical systems, and you can also have a pluralistic approach that sort of picks from all of them. But sentientism says, well, that's great, enjoy all that. The most important thing, and this is often neglected, is that we get our moral scope set correctly. Because if you imagine someone who was a deeply brilliant virtue ethicist, or someone who was a really inspirational deontological thinker, or someone who took a consequentialist approach, and these people are brilliant ethicists, deep moral thinkers, but their moral scope only includes, for example, humans who look like them, we know where that can lead, right? So however good your ethical system is, if your moral scope excludes inappropriately, you can end up in a deeply awful place. So sentientism says, look, let's focus on getting that moral scope right, such that we don't exclude any being that is capable of experiencing suffering and flourishing, because that's the best way of making sure we don't needlessly cause suffering. So it's neutral on all of those different and difficult ethical problems. It just says, let's get the baseline right of setting this moral scope such that any being that could value its own experience, we would also value. So it's very clear about moral scope, but then very pluralistic on all of the rest of ethics.
And I mean, from in the work that I do with, I don't know, have you come across Paul Gilbert and the Compassionate Mind Foundation, his work in compassion at all?
I have, but I'm not very familiar with it.
Yeah,
I've heard of them, but I haven't looked into it.
Yeah. So he's up in Derby, and he's a clinical psychologist as well, but also a researcher who's really developed this theory of the compassionate mind well beyond, just clinical practice. But he would sort of say that compassion is a sensitivity to suffering in self and others, with a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. How would that fit, really? I mean, bearing in mind moral scope, of course, but how would a sort of a definition like that fit with where you're coming from?
I think it fits really well, because I think I talk about moral scope because it's sort of more of a technical term. But I think once you've included a being in your moral scope, ethics is about having compassion for them. So I think they tightly tie together. As soon as you're within the moral scope, you're a subject of compassion. And if you're outside of the moral scope, you are not. And, therefore anything can be done to you with complete impunity. Harming or killing or destroying something that is outside matters not, because they're outside of the moral scope and they don't have any compassion. So I think moral scope and compassion tie together quite tightly. Yes. And I like that definition of compassion. And part of the reason I focus on compassion rather than empathy, and you can correct me on the terms because I'm an amateur here, is that I think empathy is more about the sensitivity part, but it doesn't imply you care, right? So you could be a sociopath and have high degree of empathy, but you just don't care about the feelings of others, even though you're very sensitive to them. Whereas compassion has both that sensitivity, but also a commitment or a motivation to help. So I think it ties together quite well.
No, you've absolutely nailed it. That there's sort of two processes, or sometimes they call them two psychologies. There's compassionate engagement, which is that sensitivity to suffering, and empathy is definitely a competency that we would bring to that, the ability to kind of understand another person's perspective or resonate with how they might be feeling. Comes into the compassionate engagement, and then compassionate action is the other half. That and motivation. In fact, Paul Gilbert would say compassion is a motivation. Really, it's a motivation to firstly be sensitive and engaged, and secondly to do something to help alleviate and prevent suffering. People may. I usually use. I usually use the. Sort of the poker player as a slightly less psychopathic example, but like an empathic poker player uses that skill of empathy to read people's tells or whatever, but they bring it to a competitive motivation. They're trying to win. They're using that to win. So sorry, you were going to say.
Well, and the second part of your definition was interesting as well, because there's another important. So one important question about compassion is, right, who and what warrants our compassion? This is this moral scope question. But there's another one about a level of demandingness too. So if we feel compassion, whether intellectually or emotionally, if we feel that compassion, how far are we supposed to go to alleviate or help? And again, there's brilliant ethicists and moral philosophers who have different views on where it's reasonable or practical to draw that line, and how demanding should we be on ourselves and on others about how much we help each other. But one of the things I've tried to do with sentientism is to set a really clear baseline that says, if we have even some moral level of minimal level of compassion or moral consideration for another being, surely we should at least not want to needlessly cause them suffering or death. surely that's the absolute minimum of compassion, is you wouldn't needlessly harm or kill. So I'm trying to draw that fairly firm baseline, and I think is unobjectionable, right? I think if someone was to say to you, look, I do have compassion for you, Stan, and I do include you in my moral consideration, but I'm now going to needlessly hurt you, you'd go, I'm not sure I believe you about the compassion on the moral consideration, because you've needlessly hurt me. What the hell is going on? So I think that baseline is pretty solid and hard to disagree with, just based on the definitions of what moral consideration, compassion mean. But you can go so much further, because, you know, not needlessly harming and killing is pretty simple obligation, but maybe compassion should take us further into actively wanting to help, or alleviating suffering we didn't cause, or enhancing the flourishing of others, not just offsetting their suffering. So again, there's a whole world of ethics and moral complexity and practical difficulties we can work through there. But again, let's at least lock in that baseline that needlessly causing suffering and death, you know, is puts someone outside of the scope of our compassion.
Yes, yeah, it's sort of, may I be helpful rather than harmful, you know, towards, well, myself and I suppose others. But
and at least not needlessly cause harm,
and not needlessly or callously cause harm. Yeah, absolutely. And Paul does now include flourishing as well in his sort of more general sense of compassion. We're sort of alleviating suffering that might be kind of happening, and we're trying to prevent suffering that could happen, and we want to support, you know, flourishing. But, you know, even with humans, we find it difficult, don't we? We're very good maybe at being super compassionate towards our own families, or, you know, our kids or something like that, even our own pets or whatever. But then, you know, take it one circle out, you know, to perhaps someone else, maybe even our neighbors, or sort of, no, but, you know, even beyond, you know, someone in another community, and certainly strangers, you know, we find it hard to be compassionate to strangers. And I suppose that's then bridging the next gap, which is to other species, I suppose, is kind of like another sort of leap for people to make with their compassion sometimes.
I think it is, and it's interesting because most people have already made that leap selectively. I mean, you talked about Bruno as an example. You know, and if you do psychological surveys and studies, it's extremely common for people to prioritize their companion animals higher than many other humans that they don't know. So that's, I think we've already breached that, and but I think there's a really strong analogy there. So on the one hand, I'd say we're always going to prioritize, right? So we might believe in universal human rights and universal compassion, and we might believe that all human beings matter, but of course we're still going to prioritize. Most of us will prioritize our family and our friends. You know, we might prioritize the nation we come from, or we might prioritize in different ways. But the important thing is that in doing that prioritization, we're still not excluding any human being from moral consideration. And this comes back to the baseline I was trying to set before. You know, I'm not going to object to you caring more about your family than a family living in Kenya. You know, I'm going to struggle to object to that, but I would expect you still not to needlessly harm or kill that family you don't know.
Yes. Yes.
Right? So I'm not suggesting you should sell all your worldly possessions, go and fly out and help them if they're facing a crisis necessarily. This is the demandingness question, right? How much should you do to help those people? But I am at least minimally suggesting you wouldn't needlessly harm or kill them. So again, it's the importance of laying that baseline and saying, okay, we're going to prioritize within our scope of moral consideration, but let's at least be clear what that boundary means. And that is just as important when we think about non-human animals, because there again, we might prioritize. You know, I'm not necessarily going to object if someone says, well, I care about humans more than non-humans. Okay, you can take that choice, and you may or may not have good reasons for doing so. But while you prioritize, I would insist that you make sure that the boundary of your moral scope is set clearly to include all sentient beings, and that you would not needlessly harm or kill any sentient being in that moral scope, even if you don't explicitly prioritize them. So prioritize away, that's fine, but let's be clear that you should not be needlessly harming or killing any being within the moral scope or within the scope of your compassion at all.
Yes.
Does that make sense? So I think it is analogous. It leaves space for prioritization, but we've got to be really clear on the boundary, every sentient being, and we have to be very clear on this minimum expectation of ethical demanding that you at least wouldn't needlessly harm or kill.
Yes.
Surely that's the least we should do for any being we have even minimal compassion for.
And yet, as a species, we do it. We are a compassionate species, and yet we are a very cruel species to our members of our own species, as again is on the world stage at the moment, sadly, and also across species. So, I mean, what are the big sort of challenges and maybe solutions there? I mean, how do we get the word out, do you think? I mean, you're doing an enormous amount of work to try to get the word out, but there's a lot of resistance. Whenever I have these conversations, there's often resistance there from people, especially about vegetarianism or veganism.
Yeah, there's an enormous cultural inertia and resonance and polarization around these topics, as with many others. In a phrase, I think the core of the issue is social norms. So people might have even found this as we've had this conversation, this experience of being led through a worldview that suggests that when we're thinking about what to believe, we should use evidence and reason. And people might go, well, of course we should use evidence and reason. What else could you do? That seems entirely sensible. I agree on that front. And they'll also be drawn through this story of saying, well, surely all suffering matters, right? Every suffering being matters. We have companion animals, we have other humans, we look at animals in the wild. Of course, their suffering matters. So in a sense, people at a theoretical level might agree with this sentientist stance and most of the things we've said so far. But then that bumps up against social norms, because while I think, the average human toddler, and I don't want to, reify young humans, because human toddlers can, have dodgy beliefs and dodgy ethics too, right? But I think most human toddlers start out with this sort of worldview, right? So they're, in a way, they're like little scientists. They're exploring the world. They don't have many preconceptions or biases. They're trying to understand what's going on. They're building, beliefs about what's going on as they look around and as they explore and as they listen. So they're like a sort of little scientific mindset. And I think they do also have this in-baked compassion, not just for other humans, but for non-human animals too. Of course, there are examples of, little boys pulling the wings off flies out of an intellectual curiosity. But I think generally, if you put a young child with a companion animal or with a pig or a cow, they wouldn't want to needlessly hurt it. So in a sense, many of the audience listening today might have been drawn through that story and agree in theory. I think many humans start out as young people with a evidence and reason commitment and a open-minded compassion that spans across the species boundary. But then we bump into social norms. So around the world, most humans today, frankly, are taught fabrications and arbitrary beliefs that are not true. And more than that, they're taught that it's acceptable to believe things for which there isn't an evidence base. So you might find that in modern phenomena of QAnon and alternative medicine and astrology, or you might find it more traditionally in a religious worldview. But it's extremely common for explicit lessons to be taught from society and family and teachers and others to say, here is a belief, you should believe it, and you should not challenge that belief using evidence and reason. That's extremely common. I suggest that's the default around the world. So you start from a naturalistic standpoint, and then you're taught to follow something that is dogmatic in some sense. So that's the social norms blocking the natural side, the epistemology side. On the sentiocentric side, we have a similar challenge, because I think, again, you'd start out from that stance of why would I want to needlessly cause suffering to any being? But nearly everyone around the world is taught, again, by society and corporations and friends and family, that it's completely acceptable, in many cases, actually a positive thing to pay for sentient beings to be needlessly harmed and killed for relatively trivial human ends. And that is an extremely strong cultural default, again, in many places around the world, that takes that sort of original sentiocentric stance of saying, well, of course, who wants to hurt animals, and turns it into something that is vicious and egregious and horrific. So when you've got these types of very powerful social norms, and I don't think it's overplaying it to say they are forms of indoctrination, those things are extremely hard to unwind, because they are embedded deep in our psychology, they're embedded deep in our sense of who we are, they're embedded deep in our social relations, and they powerfully drive our motivations, the nudges and the suggestions of things that are good to do, and the fear and the risk of going against these social norms. So I think that's the heart of the challenge we have here, is changing those social norms back to something that is more naturalistically grounded and is more generously compassionate. And in that sense, I think it has a lot in common with many other social justice change movements, where none of those have completely completed their job today, particularly as you look around the world. But certainly in some countries and some cultures, you look back on some of these challenges and go, how did society ever get that so wrong? And I think it's the same thing, right? Technically and logically, the answer is clear. If you follow evidence and reason and compassion, how could that thing ever be socially sanctioned? But the social norms were extremely powerful and very hard to change. And the hope I take is that once the cracks start to appear, social change can happen very quickly. And I think because most humans do have this latent sense that, yes, my beliefs should really be based on evidence and reason. And yes, all suffering beings warrant my compassion. I think latent, that's somewhere in nearly everybody's mind. I think we can get back to it, quite quickly.
Yes, it's really the challenge of change, though, isn't it? And when people are faced with change, they tend to struggle with that and kind of resist and sometimes will have all sorts of wonderful arguments that they shouldn't have to change, and then then we're stuck in a kind of a sort of an argument. And one of the things that I've noticed on some of your interviews is that quite often your guests will talk about kind of having more of an early epiphany around this. And the most recent guest, Matt, I can't remember his last name, but yes, what is it, sorry?
Matt Johnson.
Matt Johnson. And he mentioned, at the age of 4, really being really struck by, sort of the horror, really, of, sort of eating farm animals or eating meat. And I think I would say that I came to it, a lot later than that. Not the love and cherishing of all sentient beings and animals and so on, but just the behavior change of, even just dietary changes, for example. And a lot of people, I think, are in a little bit that boat, where they didn't have the early life epitome and then the lifelong kind of, even just through their own efforts, different socialization, but rather they are really coming now at it from this long socialization of kind of perhaps, not being so influenced by, the suffering of sentient beings. What would be your sort of top 3 tips or something for that kind of person, like who is hearing this conversation, or maybe have been thinking about these ideas along the way, but just haven't quite made some of these changes yet? What would be 3 little practical tips for them, do you think?
I guess my overarching thing to say is it's much easier than you think, and it depends where you are and the context you're in. So and that can make it much more difficult. But I think for most people, it's easier than you think. And I think that's true both in terms of moving from maybe a supernatural worldview towards a naturalistic worldview, but it's also true in terms of putting the implications of this, caring about other sentient beings into practice. So on the supernatural and the natural side, there are places around the world where that still presents serious social risk and physical risk to some people. And I've interviewed some of them. Whereas for others like me, it was actually, still felt slightly difficult, but socially there was no risk. Physically, there was no risk to be doing that. So that was a fairly easy journey. And I think on that naturalism stance, part of the reassurance is that even within communities that are very committed to a supernatural way of thinking, there are surprising numbers of people within that worldview who actually have a naturalistic way of thinking. So if you look at some of the surveys that have done of predominantly Christian or predominantly Muslim countries, the percentage of secret atheists within those communities is absolutely enormous. So part of the social change, I think, is there's more people out there who agree with you on that front than you might have thought. But you have to judge the level of risk and where you are as to how you can go on that journey. But on the sentiocentric compassion and caring about animals, and I guess for me, a direct implication of that is veganism. Again, it's easier for some people than it is for others, but for almost everybody, it's doable. So for partly because the basic foodstuffs of a non-animal diet have been staples around the world for many, many centuries. So those are available and cheap in almost every place around the world. But also because as things are shifting and as the social zeitgeist is moving, more products and alternatives and different things are coming onto the market, certainly in some of the more the richer countries, that again make it even easier to switch. There's a degree to which in places like the UK where I am now, you can walk into a supermarket and essentially go vegan without really making any sacrifices at all. We don't necessarily have a perfect steak analog yet, but on almost all of the other fronts, you could basically have a vegan alternative to all of your favorite meals and just veganize super simply. So that would be my central message. It's easier than you think for most people. And there's also support out there of people who will help and advise, and organizations that have enormous amounts of resources that can help you shift and make that transition. So those would be my words of encouragement. Reach out and get help. It is easier than you think, and just start making the change, and people will help.
Yes. I remember you interviewed a woman who had really been sort of exploring her veganism in perhaps the 60s, I think it was, or the 70s, and she made that point, just how far it's come, really, that you really can walk into a supermarket now and find what you need, whereas in those days it took a lot of work or effort to actually do it. Good.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I think I better let you go. I really appreciate you coming and having a chat. I've actually got lots of other things I sort of have in my mind that I could go on to ask you, but I'll let you go. And I'm sure that people will be interested in perhaps following you or your work and so on. How can people best find you or engage with you and some of the sentientism work that you're doing?
Yeah, well, I'd love to continue the conversation with you and your guests, whether they agree with sentientism or not. So I guess the few places I'd point people, you've mentioned the podcast already and my own YouTube channel. I've been lucky to interview some amazing people. Many of them agree with sentientism, but I've also talked to people like Frans de Waal and Massimo Pigliucci and Peter Tatchell, and philosophers and activists and celebrities from all sorts of different points of view. So that's a good starting point. There's also sentientism.info, which is the main website that has links to everything. We run a series of online communities that, again, are open to anyone interested in these ideas. It's not some sort of sentientist club. It's anyone who's interested in these ways of thinking, and you'll find them on every social media platform. So just Google it. But the biggest is on Facebook at the moment. We have just shy of, I think, 2,000 people from over 100 countries. It's a very positive social media experience so far. So I'd encourage people to come and join us there. And then the final thing we're doing more collectively is thinking about the implications of this worldview and what it might mean, not just for our personal choices as individuals, but what it might mean for systemic and institutional change. So as you go up through local and national and even regional and international governance, and you think about law and politics and corporations and government, what would the implications be for a much more widespread sentientist view? And we're laying those implications out. So we've done some interesting thought experiments, like taking the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and rewriting it as a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. And we've taken the Sentientist Development Goal, or the Sustainable Development Goals, and rewritten them as Sentientist Development Goals. So there's some interesting work there that people can delve into on the website. We can say, look, let's take some of the progress we've made as a human species and literally just rethink it, bearing in mind all sentient beings and what might that do for us. And I think it does two things. One is obviously it's much better for all the sentient beings that are out there, but it's also good for us human beings too. Every time we extend our moral scope, it tends to be beneficial for those doing the extension too. So
yes, well, great. I mean, as Matthew Ricard says, compassion has a twofold benefit. It obviously benefits the person or the being, the sentient being that we're compassionate towards, but it's also a benefit to us as well. So, but yes, look.
Indeed. I mean, compassion and cooperation have proven evolutionarily adaptive. So I hope they continue to be. Otherwise, we're in trouble.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Well, Jamie, thank you very much once again for being on Compassion in a T-shirt, I guess, or at least for coming and chatting to me. And I look forward to keeping in touch.
Please do. Please do. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, mate.